Well, hello, Endow ladies. Simone here, Director of Program Growth, and I am with the wonderful Margaret Perry. Welcome to the Endow podcast, Margaret.
Thank you, Simone.
I'm so happy you're here. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Margaret, I'm going to read her bio because it's very fancy. I could do this informally as a friend, but I will read the formal biography here. So she is a sales manager for a Virginia-based, sustainability-focused fine wine importer and distributor. And prior to that, she managed a Michelin-rated restaurant in Washington, D.C., and before her time in the hospitality industry, she worked in higher education nonprofits, studied literature and philosophy, and wrote about children's literature for magazines such as First Things and St. Austin Review. She was born and raised in Northern California and has lived in Virginia for 13 years, which some say make her a native, but I want to disagree with that as a Californian myself. And in her free time, she reads an absurd number of British mysteries, gardens, and hikes in the Shenandoah. Do you see now why I have invited you to come on the Endow podcast to inspire us all? So today, I'd really love to, so as you know, Endow is inspired by John Paul II, who, like many wonderful saints and people out there, was, in addition to being a brilliant philosopher, was also a poet of sorts and a theater guy. So we want to have, because it's the holiday season and hopefully Endow groups and women are planning their autumnal gestures of poetry readings and wine tastings and cider, who knows. We wanted to have an episode where my authority, which is Margaret, can kind of guide us by the hand and lead us and inspire us. So I when I think about the good life, I think of you, Margaret.
Oh my goodness. Embarrassing, but thank
I
you.
do. It's the truth. Let's just start off. I just want to know, first off, what does poetry mean to you? What does it mean for you personally?
Ooh. That's a great question. I mean, I studied literature, but I would say I mostly read novels and short stories, not necessarily a lot of poetry. But poetry became, especially as I was developing my professional career, it became kind of a touchstone for clarity and perception.
Wow.
That, you know, you can have distilled in this tiny little thing that takes you a minute to read max. You can have this incredibly strong image, even if it's not anything other than describing a seashell. But it's there for you, and it's something like really concrete, and complex, but not inaccessible. So I kept turning to it, and I actually turned to it a lot in really, really difficult times, as like when I didn't have time or energy, really mostly just time, because who doesn't have energy to read? It's the best. But like when I didn't have time to like really sink into something, I would grab poetry and read 3 poems, 10 poems,
Wow.
a whole book in an hour and a half, which is a ridiculous way to consume poetry. It's not recommended, but like also it started things out.
It just brought things out for you.
Exactly.
It was a remedy for you. Oh, yeah. A balm for your soul during difficulties.
It really was. And I mean, we know that too, as Christians, we know that, because what's the most consoling work of the Bible is the Psalms, right?
Right.
And that's poetry. They're songs, they're prayers, but they're poems. And it's that whatever translation you read, there's still poetic things like repeated lines and repeated images and a distillation of a really complex thing like a battle into, 6 lines, right? And we go to that again and again for comfort, even when they're literally have nothing to do with our particular circumstances.
Yeah. But there's a human experience that's transmitted through the beauty of the poetry. I love that. What a beautiful, beautiful answer to that. And I think why I really wanted to pick your brain about this is like, what if you're the sort of person asking for a friend who wants because I love poetry, but it's difficult. And I think it's difficult for many people. I don't think I'm the only one. That, you say, well, okay, I'm going through a difficult time, or I need an image to just maybe pray with, or just to, and you reminded me when you were answering of my friend Scott, who said that listening to certain kinds of concert music, classical music, without which he said his life would be incomprehensible. And I feel that it sounded like similar to what you were saying, right? That the wisdom, the clarity, the consolation that comes through encountering good poetry. So I guess that kind of answers my second question about why should we care about it. But on a more philosophical level, is what do you have to say to people who say, as we often hear, poetry is so useless. What do we do with it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, I don't even want to bother answering that question, right? Like, it's poetry is music, and it's art, it's painting, it's it's photography, it's a play, it's all of these things, and all of those things are also, I mean, it's the encounter with creativity that is so compelling, and whatever form it takes, whether it's, gosh, I just went to an exhibit of abstract, very famous abstract sculptor, and I couldn't understand any of it, but the friend I was with was like, her mind was blown, right? Poetry is just another medium for that experience of the creative force. And of course, we know that beauty ties us to something greater, right? And can open our eyes to something greater. But it's also kind of like, we can go very big and Balthazarian on that and talk about aesthetics and all that, but actually it's humbler than that, right? It's the little moments of our day that we observe as beautiful, and as a Christian that we observe as part of God's mercy towards us, right? And a poem, in its brevity, and it's both, like, obviously relatively short poems, but also in its brevity of, like, you don't have a lot of, even if you're using iambic pentameter, you don't have that many syllables in every line. Like, you have to use each word. And in that brevity, there can be a lot of weight and a lot of movement. And I think the best way to start accessing that is actually to start thinking about them like music. And by that, I don't mean, for some people, yes, certainly serious music, or, sacred music or something like that. But I actually also just mean, folk songs and indie rock.
It doesn't have to be Shakespearean song.
Right. Yeah. It doesn't have to be. And so, if there's some obscure line from some indie rock song that you love, but you don't know what it means, that's poetry. That's what's happening there.
Yeah, it's so funny hearing you talk, because it seems to me that when I really speak to people who are authorities, so glad. Where's mine?
Where is yours?
For the podcast listeners, she's drinking wine because it's a poetry and Pinot conversation, and I'm drinking coffee, which was a huge mistake.
Well, it's also much earlier where you are.
That is true. And I don't know that I should drink on the job, although I feel like we should remove that stigma nationwide. Internet, anyway. I'm an American after all, not a European, but
right. Last.
But it seems to me, when I speak to people who are real authorities on music or poetry and so forth, there is a real humility that's there, whereas it seems like the pseudo-intellectuals or the pseudo-musicians, the pseudo-authorities are the ones that are so quick to, like, be judgmental about, like, oh, unless you're reading lofty poetry, you aren't reading poetry at all. So what are your strong opinions about that, if you have?
She says strong opinions with a knowing wink, because she knows I have them.
Because we're friends, I know you.
So again, I think one of the things that we struggle with as adults coming to understand this medium is that there are huge schools of poetry and different kinds of poetry, and even in you know, even in modern poetry, whatever that means, or contemporary poetry, which is most of the piece, all of the pieces that I've chosen today, even in them, there's a confessional school, and there's an observational school, and there's an obscure school where everything is abstract and you don't understand the first time you, or the 20th time that you read it, how the words relate to each other. And there's the difficulty of the poetry that we actually are introduced to as students in junior high and high school. I think things like, you know, like Longfellow in The Children's Hour, which I'm sure many of us have read when we were kids, or Robert Louis Stevenson's Garden of Verses, or the silly things like Lewis Carroll's The Jabberwocky and stuff like that, right? Like those are accessible to us when we're young, but we never make that jump to, then we start reading some very serious poetry that's beautiful, but also difficult. Rime of the Ancient Mariner takes 30 minutes to read aloud. It's not easy, it's dense. Yeah. So that can scare us. I think I'm going on a little tangent there, sorry. To bring it back, I think one of the dangers is just throwing out the baby with the bathwater, right? Like we need to, if you want to experience poetry, you need to figure out how you like to experience it.
Yeah, you have to do what you like. You know what? Ben Heschmeyer said the same thing when we were recording a podcast on Bach.
Yeah.
I admitted to him, like, oh, I'm on the Beethoven, Mozart end of things. Also, I love the Romantics, but like I know Bach is like the Bach and like the right. But I can't quite get into, except for the Brandenburg Concerto. I want to be like, oh yes, I totally appreciate all the nuance here, but I'm just not there yet. My soul's not there yet. You know, and he's like, just start with what you love. And I hear you saying the same thing. Like, if you want to get into this thing, which is worth getting into, just start with where you're at and let it grow from there. I think that's really wise. What are you missing if you don't engage poetry? What's the loss?
I think it's a loss of vision, really. I actually think of poetry a lot like a photograph or a painting. And I actually think of my relationship to it a lot like I think about the way that I take photographs and share them on social media, because that's life now. But I would say that I'm a creative person, but I'm not I don't have an art form that I'm fluent in. But when I started taking photographs, I started sort of pinpointing things that struck me, whether it was the way, you know, shadows fell across a wall, or a particular flower, or, you know, the light on a kitchen table. Well, those are also the things that are noted in poetry. And that's not true of all poetry. And it's not really true of formal poetry pre-20th century. But there is, like, to me, poetry is a way to bring your emotions and your emotions into focus, really. And I think we know that already because we feel that with music. And music is, again, just poetry set to
rhythm and beat,
a melody and a rhythm. Right. And so we know that that's a thing that happens. Even if it feels obscure or obtuse, it's not, because it's part of our daily experience. And so to me, that's what it is. It's like kind of focusing in on why do I care the way that the light hits the side of a wall? What is that telling me? What is that? And usually poetry will say, okay, here's the shadow against the wall. Or, for example, the William Carlos Williams one, which we all learned in high school and didn't understand then, but like, so much depends on a red wheelbarrow in the rain with white chickens or something like that. I don't remember exactly, right? Why does so much depend on that? Why does it matter how the light falls against a wall? Well, it did strike me. And now I have something to think about. And so, yeah, a lot depends on it, right? And
Yeah.
it's up to us as the receivers of the poem and the readers to sort of come to our own conclusion. But he helped me see beyond just the red wheelbarrow to something that there's more than just that, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. I'm thinking of Dostoevsky's Beauty Will Save the World, and that there is an element, and there's a frustration. If you're frustrated with mystery, then you will be frustrated with poetry. I think, especially if it's good poetry. Is it worth reading poems that you find too difficult? Is it worth it?
That's a good question. I might have to say not always.
I knew you were going to say something like that.
Yeah. I don't, I love poetry, so I do read things that I struggled with in high school. I've reread The Rime of the Ancient Mariner many times, and I continue to struggle with it. As my dad would say, I didn't like it then and I don't like it now. But
right.
But I also think that there are writers who, once you start reading poetry, you will find writers who you get the images right away, you see them, and then you want to start digging deeper, right? So for example, one of the poems that I was going to talk about, and we can read it if you want, is Mary Oliver,
yes,
who passed away a couple years ago, and she had she's a very observational style, and where she sees the natural world and she draws something almost confessional out of it about herself and her relationship to it. But she also had a pretty big conversion towards the end of her life. And her before that became apparent, there's like more and more touching on the transcendental in her poems.
Wow.
So last week I was stuck in an airport because I did something very stupid and missed my flight. And I went to the bookstore and I bought myself a book of her poetry from the 80s. Now, most of the poetry of hers that I know is from the 2000s, right? And even from the 2010s, like written in the last, or published in the last 10 years. This was a really difficult volume for me, and it doesn't have that same immediacy, but I do love her and I love her vision. So that's, while it's hard for me and it's work for me, and I didn't get the like consoling feeling that I wanted because I was stuck in the Houston airport, right. I did actually, like, I'm going to go back to it and read through it again multiple times. So just because someone says it's good doesn't mean that it's something that you'll like. And I think one of the joys of being an adult and not being in school anymore is that you don't have to read what you don't want to or what you don't like.
Like you can do what you want. You can do what you want, Simone.
Yeah. Just, you're off the hook.
I know, you can just enjoy life and live it. I know, but there's just, you know how it is sometimes in like liberal arts circles, which are our circles, where it's like you gotta read, these are the poems, and it's anyway, that's so neat. And so poetry, poetry how you pray most?
I mean,
too personal.
I mean,
yes,
I'm not very good at off the cuff prayer. So,
well,
is poetry, I mean, I think most prayers are poems.
Right. But I mean, like your encounter with God in poetry.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, through poetry. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I think so. And the world is charged with God, as we know from our dear friend, poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, the grandeur of God, right? So our experience of the world, when we're attuned to God's providence and his mercy, is going to be, it's going to be, a touchstone to him, a reaching out to him. And I think poetry and its kind of unique, like very concrete images that also pull to something emotional are it's a unique relationship of that.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I know we've got like 5 poems, but I think probably
don't have to do all of them.
I think we should just do the one that you chose, because I do want to talk to you about wine, which is the
Yes.
second part of this conversation. And
Yeah.
I don't want to rush this poem. So before we start that, who's your favorite poet? A ridiculous question. Ridiculous.
It is and it isn't. I mean, my favorite poet is probably T.S. Eliot.
Okay.
I say that having just told everybody that poetry is accessible. Eliot is not.
Okay, I have tried.
Yeah. But I also like, this is, I mean, I had to do this for school. I had to write, my first big paper was on the Wasteland.
Yeah.
And I just couldn't make head or tails out of it, but I had to. This was the assignment. So I ended up just listening to it. I would go for a walk every day and I'd put it in my Walkman.
I love that.
And I would walk, and it was the recording of him reading it is like 26 minutes. And so I would walk 26 minutes, listen to it, turn around, walk 26 minutes back, listen to it again. And like getting into the rhythm of it. So that was really what kind of formed my poetic rhythm, I would say, in my head. And so he's still the favorite, but I also really struggle with him. And, you know, I recognize the masterpiece that the Four Quartets is, but I also only have a few bits, have a handle on a few bits, you know, but that's also, I mean, right. Like that's like a Beethoven symphony, or
the second movement of the second symphony is my
you just like, how will you ever handle it? Or it's, I mean, and with Bach too, right? Like Yo-Yo Ma just came out with another recording of the Bach cello concertos, which he's done so many times, and he still says he sees more every time.
I know. I mean, that's the brilliance of it.
You know, with any of these things. So I do think, and I wanted to say, so I want to mention here, and maybe we can put it in the show notes, a couple things if you are interested in getting into poetry. There are a handful of authors who are, I'm not going to call them Christian poets, but they are great poets who happen to be Christian. And I think that they're a really good entry point. And again, with the mindset of the Psalms, which again, like most of the Psalms are about things that aren't really very, I mean, like how many of them are about battles, right? You know, but so with that kind of mindset, think about reading them. Some of them are alive today and still publishing, and some of them are not, but Mary Oliver is definitely one, especially her last 3 or 4 volumes. Jane Kenyon is really magnificent. She's not as observational and nature-driven, or she's not as nature-driven as Mary Oliver, but similarly observational. I think both of us have a love for Wendell Berry, which is the poem that we're going to read together. And then a couple explicitly Christian ones are Dana Gioia, who is from California, and Scott Cairns, who's I think he's from Nebraska or Kansas City, or anyway, he's from the Midwest, but he is an Eastern Orthodox. He's in the Eastern Orthodox Church, and he writes really beautiful, rich, and layered, and mystical, as you would expect from an Eastern rite. Yes.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. They're great starts. The other thing that I will say is, I definitely do not endorse everything that things like poetry.org or poetry, which runs Poetry Magazine, everything that they publish. A lot of it is not to my enjoyment, but they do a lot of like they do theme roundups or seasonal roundups, and I find that that's really helpful too, to start getting into a poet, is like read what poems they have to say about autumn, because they're
I love that. That's a great resource for Endow women if they don't already know.
Yeah, because then you can start exploring, and if there's a poem you really, really like, just start finding other poems by that person and see if you like all of them, and you'll start going down the rabbit hole. So
I love that. It's a great place to start. Thank you for that. Yeah,
of course.
Fantastic.
All right, well, we're going to talk about wine, but first let's read Wendell Berry. So this is called To My Mother, and it in fact was first published in Poetry Magazine. I'm not sure what year, but I really love it. And I think it's a fun one to share because I very much don't identify with the speaker, but I very much identify with the sentiment. So
very nice.
It's called To My Mother. I was your rebellious son. Do you remember? Sometimes I wonder if you do remember. So complete has your forgiveness been. So complete has your forgiveness been. I wonder sometimes if it did not precede my wrong, and I erred, safe found within your love, prepared ahead of me the way home or my bed at night, so that almost I should forgive you, who perhaps foresaw the worst that I might do, and forgave before I could act, causing me to smile now, looking back, to see how paltry was my worst compared to your forgiveness of it already given. And this then is the vision of that heaven of which we have heard, where those who love each other have forgiven each other, where for that the leaves are green, the light, a music in the air, and all is unentangled, and all is undismayed.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I really love that description of heaven. And I think of those lines, especially the light and music in the air, all the time. And it's a really powerful image, but it's also, you know, I wasn't rebellious, nor am I a son, but it is a relationship that we know, and it is the relationship of us to the Father too. So
yeah, I love it. I hadn't read this one before. Yeah, there's so much. Is it the last stanza? That's the last stanza is the one that strikes you the most.
Yeah.
The light of music in the air. Beautiful. Well, I'll link it to the show notes. And I think to me, when I read it, or this is now the third time, it is truly like the hidden secret of the faith. That is so glossed over, unknown, yet to be discovered. And then there it is in this like very accessible,
and humble little
way.
Yeah, exactly.
Beautiful. Well, shall we move on to wine?
Sure thing. Yeah.
Great. Now you've been inspired. We're going to have our autumnal events with poetry. We're going to start a relationship with poems and poetry. We'll be unafraid. We're all grown up, so we don't have to read what other people say we do.
You don't have to do that.
Modern poetry is not off limits, within reason. And now, tell me about your love of wine. And
oh my goodness. Well, I think we kind of thought of putting these two together because they go together.
They go together.
One of the first scenes in all of literature has to do with wine. I don't know if you can tell what I'm going to say. But one of the first...
The Greek tragedies? Is that what you're...
Homer.
Of course.
The Odyssey. The Cyclops, who has captured Odysseus. They don't have wine. They're shepherds. They don't have wine. They don't have grapes. They don't have vineyards. They don't have fruit. They just have and
therefore no life.
Yeah, I know. What are they doing? I wonder they only have one eye. So Odysseus gets the Cyclops drunk, and that's how then he ties himself to the sheep, and he and his ship's crew escape the Cyclops, and et cetera, et cetera. Cunning little Odysseus. But there is a sympathy between these two things for sure. So
I love that. And unrelated but related is our Lord's first miracle.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
The source of poetry itself.
I mean, there's more love poetry than anything else in the world. So
that is true. So tell us, advise us for this season.
Oh boy. So yeah, I mean, this is the question that I get all the time, no matter who I'm talking to, or even when I go home to Napa, which, P.S., is where California wine
We want to be
great.
cool like you. We want to be like, yes, drink this.
Yeah.
No,
Where do I drink? What do I do?
exactly. Local vineyard that, and
Yeah.
we want to be fancy.
Yeah. I mean, my first piece of advice, just like with poetry, is to go experience it.
Yeah.
And just like poetry, you need to know where to start. And this is going to be one of the more judgmental things that I say on this podcast. But Simone knows me well enough to know that that's kind of bold. You will not first experience wine in a good way if you're buying it at your grocery store or if you're buying it at Trader Joe's. I recognize that Endow is a national organization and has women all over the country and
international,
yeah. Well, I really can't speak to international laws about wine at all. I know that every state is different when it comes to experiencing wine, but I really want to encourage you to find a local wine store and tell them honestly what your price point is. And then start having a conversation about the things that you like and the things that you don't like, and let them start picking for you, because you will spend less and drink better if you're buying from a local place. But not more importantly, but equally important is that you're going to be buying wine made by real people in real places, providing for their families and for the infrastructure of these towns, and whether it's, some obscure little hillside in Italy or, the Napa Valley, which sounds really glamorous, but is full of hardworking people. So I really want to encourage you to experiment and be okay with having a bad bottle, and go back to the same shop and tell them why you didn't like that bottle, because then they're going to start being like, oh, okay, so you like fruity, but you don't like that kind of fruit. Good to know. Let's try this over here, but a good shop is going to help take care of you, and stretch your perception of wine. But also, all of that being said, the most important thing is that you like it. That's actually what matters about wine. So
just like the poem, just like
exactly. That's all that, and if you don't like wine and you like beer, that's fine. Like whatever. But
I love that. I love that. This is related to our Catholic social teaching and Endow study that we released, right? It's solidarity and subsidiarity. Yes. Your local wine shop, your local vineyard, getting to know them, the hardworking nature of it. Doing something that's becoming less and less.
Yeah. And I promise you, like, your local wine shop probably won't have a $7 wine, but their $13 bottle is better than anything you could get for $17 at your average grocery store.
Why is that?
It's, so I'm a distributor and an importer. So our company brings wine in from Spain, Italy, France, Austria, Germany, Georgia, all over the world. And we are seeking out things that are extraordinary at each price point. And no distributor can get away with not having wines that wholesale for $7. And a wine that wholesales for $7 costs you about $12. So we are seeking that out, but we're also seeking it out according to a set of principles. And so for us, it's sustainability. And that means wine made by real people in real places and in a way that is looking towards the future, both in big picture, but small picture too. A lot of these wineries are families, and they're looking to the next generation to continue the work, because this is actually their livelihood. It's not a glamour thing. It's how they work. How they live.
Right.
And so for us to be able to share those things, like, it's our job to find the obscure and the small, and therefore the inexpensive.
I love that.
But to share them with you. So, but we can't sell to a grocery store. We don't bring in enough stock for a grocery store, So it's really the smaller shops that can start seeking those things out.
Well, I know what I'll be doing this weekend.
Going to every liquor store.
I'm having an autumnal pumpkin poetry night, and I'm gonna take all these recommendations. I think that's so exciting, and it's especially in like post-COVID life. I mean, it's not like we weren't lonely before, or I feel like isolated before, but what a great way to feel connected to your community in a new way if you aren't already living that. And I guess I have to, before we say goodbye, I guess I have to ask you, because watching your life unfold in the last, I don't know, decade or so, it seems it's so unique, so interesting, so unrepeatable, like everybody else, but it's unique and very inspiring. And in terms of like your personal vocation, right, that these things are flowing out of who you are. How has that experience been for you? Because I mean, did you know that this would be your life? I mean,
no, not at all.
Not at all, right? So,
I mean, if I had known I was going to be in wine, I grew up in Napa, California. Why am I here in Arlington, Virginia, where it's 90 degrees and 900% humidity? But if I hadn't come to DC, I wouldn't have met you.
That's true. There's silver linings.
But no, I mean, I didn't know that this was going to be the path by any means. And in fact, like as you said in the bio, like I worked in restaurants for about, I think probably about 9 years total, part-time and full-time, and managed a really wonderful high-end restaurant in DC. And I really thought that was going to be it. That was going to be the job. There's still no job that I've loved more, but our personal vocations still have to be vocations, which means you have to be able to listen to the voice of God.
Yeah, right.
And I couldn't in that life. And it turned into, I'm grateful for it, and I'm grateful for the relationships that I have with the people that I worked with. And I'm really glad to know that it's not where I should be, and it's not where I will blossom.
Yeah.
And so it's been a hard thing. And I mean, honestly, like to start trying to sell wine and build a territory in the middle of COVID is not the easiest thing in the world. But it was really wonderful to be able to serve my customers, my community, in difficult times as they were serving their communities, and so I'm removed from the people that I served day to day in restaurant life, but I'm actually, it's a much more balanced thing. So I guess the trick is to experiment with everything. Experiment with your poetry, experiment with your wine, and maybe soberly and carefully and thoughtfully experiment with your career.
But that's the thing, it's more than just a career. It's
right.
Yes. You in there. That's the vocational element that I think is so,
which is just, I mean, that's 100% God. Like I could not have imagined having the fullness that I have right now, in the time before. And it's still very much a job. And it's still very much a job that I'm happy to close the computer and walk away from.
Yes.
But it's a job that is in actual relation to who I am as a person, which means that I'm actually able to serve it better, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of the trick, which no one told us when we were going to all of those happy hours about careers and vocations in DC.
Yeah.
No one told us that trick.
Oh, no, that's so true. Oh my goodness.
I think you just have to live it.
You just have to live it with the adventurous life of the Holy Spirit and God, because it's always, I have found hilarious and surprising and weird. Definitely weird. Definitely weird, but in a good way. So any final words of inspiration and the holiday season and the Endow women who just the love of the intellectual life, because I mean, Margaret, I could talk to you about so many
talk about so many things,
but any final words that are just burning in your head?
I mean, it was funny when I looked up one of the Jan Kenyon poems that now, of course, I can't find it. There was like one that was like literally 4 sentences, and I was like, oh, that's what I should have picked. That would be good last words, but I can't find them. So, no, I mean, I just, I love these things, and I'm so grateful to be able to share them with you and with all of your listeners. And I really like beautiful things to be shared, but also find your beautiful thing to be shared, whether it's music or poetry or clothing or gardening or wine or murder mysteries.
I thought of you the other day because in the Armenian church, I don't remember the spiritual significance, but something about the exaltation of the cross and basil plants. So at the back of at the end of liturgy, they have all these basil plants that they're blessing and they're giving them out at the end of the mass. And I'm like,
what a joy.
I'm going to go home and plant this, and I'm going to tell Margaret about it because it's just so, the good life that you represent in my life. So,
oh my gosh. Well, I would love to know that significance, but
I know I should have been paying attention, but I was dreaming. The aroma got to me. And
I know, right?
I need to pay attention.
Pay attention to anything but basil when there's basil.
Yeah, my mom's like, is it because it's Saint Basil? I'm like, I don't think it's anything to do with Saint Basil, but I'll find out for you. But it's really cool. We're very carnal people, the Armenians.
Yeah.
Granites, basils. We give out grapes for the Assumption.
Right.
We like food. Anyway, well, thank you so much, Margaret.
You're welcome.
And I guess people can, if the women are listening to this and they're like, I need to talk to her directly, I think maybe they can find you. I don't know. Findable, but.
Well, my Instagram is private.
Okay. So but there's always Instagram requests.
Yes, exactly. Send me a note. I'm at Buy Mags. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.